Well, thank you for joining me on exercise 3G, and I'm looking at question 2C. Find the real and imaginary parts of the following complex number, and it is 1 plus 2i over 1 minus 2i. Then subtract, this fraction is 1 minus 2i over 1 plus 2i. Well, I look at the denominators and you can see that these two denominators are actually conjugates already. So what we will do is we will cross multiply and have common denominators. So on the first fraction, we've got 1 plus 2i over 1 minus 2i, and our conjugate will bring that up and multiply by 1 plus 2i over 1 plus 2i. That's the denominator from the other fraction. And we've got on the second fraction 1 minus 2i over 1 plus 2i. So top and bottom we multiply by 1 minus 2i and 1 minus 2i. Okay, let's see. Now we're going to have common denominators, which is great. And our imaginary components on the denominator will disappear because we're multiplying by the conjugates. So let's look at the first fraction. 1 times 1 is 1. 1 times 2i is 2i. 2i times 1 is 2i. 2i times 2i is 4i squared. Now for our denominator, 1 times 1 is 1. 1 times 2i is 2i. Negative 2i times 1 is negative 2i. Negative 2i times 2i is negative 4i squared. Now, our denominator for the second fraction will be the same. So I'm just going to extend that and say, okay, it's all over this particular denominator because they're both the same. And let's expand here. But because I've got a minus, I'm going to put this in a square bracket. 1 times 1 is 1. When I say because I've got a minus, here I've got a minus, so that's minus. We've got to be careful that we minus the whole thing. So that's why I'm putting it in a square bracket. 1 times negative 2i is negative 2i. Negative 2i times 1 is negative 2i. And negative 2i times negative 2i is positive 4i squared. Now we can simplify. We've got this 4i squared. Let's change, because I squared is a negative 1, an important concept in complex numbers. So we've got a 4i squared, which is a 4 times negative 1. So I'll change that to being this one, to being a negative 4. I'll change that to be a negative 4. And underneath we've got a negative 4i squared. So a negative 4i squared is a negative 4 times negative 1. So we'll change that to a positive 4 when we get there. So let's look at this. So we got 1 plus 4i, so we can group those two, minus 4, as we said, that was changed, minus, this is 1 minus 4i. Now plus 4i squared becomes minus 4. Our denominator here, this will cancel, so we're left with a 1, and minus 4i squared becomes plus 4. just remove these brackets, shall we? So that becomes plus, that becomes a minus 1. That becomes a plus 4i, and that becomes a plus 4, and it's all over 5. 1 plus 4 is 5. And here we go. 1 minus 1 is 0. Negative 4 plus 4 is 0. And we've got 8i over 5. And there we have it. We have no real component, and we've got an imaginary part. So they wanted the real component and the imaginary component. So the real component and the imaginary component. The real component is 0, and the imaginary component is 8 over 5. Or 1.6 if you like, or 1 3/5. I'll just leave it at that. Until next time, I hope this has helped. Until next time, stay happy.